Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks very much to Caroline and Nick for asking me to come along and speak tonight. Um, so I'm going to speak about sort of my experiences with underwater fluorescence photography, look a bit at sort of background information, how I got into fluoro diving, the equipment that is needed, sort of my equipment that I use, and a bit on the camera settings, um, sort of the settings I use with the camera that I have, and sort of species that I found to fluoresce, and a bit of the post-processing that I do. Right. So a bit about myself. I've been diving for around 12 years. Went in 2010 in Dundee. So I live near just outside Dundee in Scotland, and pretty much all of my diving is around the Scottish west coast, a little bit on the east coast. Shame to say I haven't really dived in England much at all. Um, yeah, obviously love UK diving. The variety of marine life and habitats that we have here is just amazing. Don't need to tell any of you that. Um, I do enjoy the odd warm water dive on holiday, but prefer UK diving. So I work in science myself, in crop science. So I'm a plant pathologist at the James Hutton Institute in Dundee. My degree is in biotechnology, so I'm not a marine biologist, but I do have a huge interest in sort of marine life and the underwater world. And I've spent a lot of my time learning about underwater species and habitats. So after a few years of diving, I knew I wanted to get into underwater photography, so mainly so I could capture all the amazing marine life that I've seen on the dives. Um, got into underwater photography in 2012. A very basic point and shoot camera for quite a few years. Upgraded slightly to a Canon S120 point and shoot, and then after that to the camera that I'm using now, which is still a compact sort of Canon G7X Mark II. So obviously most would still consider that a basic kit, and it obviously does have its limitations, but I do like the compact model. I like the size. I've been using that for 5 years now. Possibly looking to upgrade soon, but yeah, not quite decided what yet. So how did I get into underwater fluorescence? So I'd seen a bit of coral fluorescence. I think it was in the first Blue Planet series years ago, and then there was a wee segment in BBC series Beneath British Seas back in 2012, which had people doing a night dive in St Abbs, and they showed light bulb sea squirts fluorescing. I just thought that was amazing that we had that sort of in our waters here, so I wanted to get into that straight away to find out sort of what other species we had in our waters that would fluoresce. So I started doing a lot of research into underwater fluorescence, sort of what species had been found to fluoresce and where they had been found. Um, a lot of it was sort of tropical seas and coral reefs, what I was finding to begin with. So underwater fluorescence or UV night dives, as many places still call them, are certainly more widely known in tropical waters, in coral reefs, etc. And there was little evidence to show that this had been explored much at all in temperate or colder seas. So I was obviously curious to see which other British species would fluoresce. So the main species I was interested in trying this out with to begin with were fireworks anemones, sort of cup corals, and pretty much anything else I could just to see what was out there. So for a long time it wasn't very easy to get hands-on equipment, and also the first cameras I had just weren't capable of capturing it. Ideally, the conditions need to be quite dark, very low ambient light. It is possible to capture during the day. Um, Quite a few people have been doing this. I think Susanna Snowden-Smith published a really nice article recently with her experiences capturing fluorescence in the daytime. It's got some really nice images. But generally, the type of image I want to get, I aim for night dives or sort of sea lock dives, usually during the winter where it's dark. Even during the day, sort of below this sort of surface freshwater layer. I think most people know it can often be like night dives, even during the day. It can get a wee bit tricky in the summer with sort of lighter evenings and generally pretty good visibility and good ambient light, even deeper down. I don't think I've met many other divers that would be happy with dark dives during the day in the summer. But for the shots I want to get, I prefer either dark or very little ambient light. Too much ambient light can create sort of a greeny yellow haze in the images due to the sort of yellow barrier filter that we use. And it's not easy to remove that in post either. Of course, if the subject has very bright fluorescence, it's possible to eliminate ambient light with the camera settings. I'll talk a bit about that later on. So a wee bit of background about underwater fluorescence. So I'm not a physicist at all, so this will be very, very simplified and brief explanation. So it was kind of first discovered, well, the first evidence of it being observed was around 1927. So it's not a new thing. And that was from someone named Charles Phillips noticed that anemones in a tide pool in England, in Torbay, appeared to be growing especially bright green, which I'm assuming were snake-lox anemones. And there's various records of fluorescence being observed in aquariums and labs between then and then what was possibly the first record of divers taking UV lights underwater in the sort of late 1950s, early 60s. There's records of Jacques Cousteau observing underwater fluorescence, but I don't think anyone's sure when this was. So more recently, Nightsea founder Charles Mazel began building his own UV lights in the mid-70s and taking these underwater to observe underwater fluorescence. He then went on to develop the Nightsea light range with Light in Motion. And if anyone's interested on the Light in Motion Dive Facebook page, Charles Mazel did a really good live stream sort of interactive talk back in 2020 where he speaks a lot about his sort of experience of getting into underwater fluorescence, building his own lights, and he sort of dives with that equipment later on. It's still on the Facebook page, so it's worth a watch if you're interested in sort of his work. So the light is recommended to be used to excite underwater fluorescence, sort of change from UV range to blue range, which is quite close to UV, and this was found to give better results. So Charles Mazel, Lynn Miner from Fire Dive Gear, and Horst Grunz, a German diver who's done a lot of research into this, have all posted detailed work about why they think blue light gives better results than UV light for observing fluorescence. That's not to say UV light doesn't work, and it certainly does, and it can be useful for certain subjects. So a brief explanation about what is going on. So the LED lights that are produced for observing fluorescence generally emit light around 450 sort of nanometers just in the blue light range, so it's not quite into the ultraviolet, where it starts at around 395. So this sort of high energy short wavelength light is absorbed by various compounds such as different proteins and minerals within sort of marine life and other species. This high energy wavelength is sort of absorbed at an electron level within the atoms, and the energy is then released in the form of a longer wavelength, sort of lower energy light, which is the green, yellow, and sort of red fluorescence that we're seeing when this longer wavelength is emitted back at us. Some of these proteins have been identified, such as GFP, you might have heard of, first observed in jellyfish in 1962. This protein has become one of the most important used in contemporary bioscience. So my sort of gear setup, some of the kit I have. So I have my trusty Canon G7X Mark II compact with a fantasy housing. I have had this camera about 5 years. I'm thinking about an upgrade quite soon. I'm still not decided what yet. I like this housing because it has the 67mm port, and all camera control sort of camera functions are easily accessible by the buttons on the housing. So I have a range of different blue lights which I've used over the years. Light in Motion Gobi Nightsea light, which is probably the least powerful out of all the ones I have, but still works very well. These Fire Dive Gear Riff lights, which are brighter again than the Light in Motion Gobi, and then the brightest lights I have, are these Light in Motion Solar Nightseas, which I got just last year actually. So I first got the light and motion Gobi lights around 2015, and then sort of improved the gear over the years. So all these lights have a wavelength of around 450 nanometers, and they all have blue LEDs as well as a dichroic filter in front of the LED. So this filters the light emitted further to give the optimum wavelength for observing fluorescence. It is possible to use these filters, so dichroic filters, with strobes or white torch lights to filter down to get the blue light, which does work, not as well as having a blue light and the filter. So to observe the fluorescence, sort of effectively, you need the blue lights and then a yellow barrier filter. So these barrier filters that reflect any excess, block any excess reflected blue light that's coming back from the subject or the surrounding area. And this allows you or the camera to observe just the fluorescence that's being emitted. So I use a range of different barrier filters on the camera, and each of these block out different levels of blue light, which can give obviously different images used with the different lights as well. So this Heliopan Yellow 12 blocks out basically all blue light completely, so all you're seeing is the yellow or red, orange, or pink fluorescence, no blue light at all in the image. The Fire Dive Gear filter lets a bit more of the blue light through, which can look quite nice with certain subjects, and the Leaf filter, which works best with the light and motion solar night sea light. So this is the closest to the filters that Night Sea sell, and this is somewhere in between the sort of the Heliopan and the Fire Dive Gear, so it lets a little bit of blue light through. So I find I use the Fire Dive Gear and the Leaf filter most often, so I think some blue in the image I think looks the nicest for most subjects. It's personal taste really, how you want the images to look. I do think the sort of cat sharks look a bit more striking with no blue left in the image, and it also depends on how brightly the subject fluoresces. So if there's too much blue left, then that can still drown out the weaker fluorescence. I also use a couple of wet diopters as well. So I'll look through some of my earlier shots. So these obviously aren't great. These are just when I started around 2015, 2016. And these were with my Canon S120 and a single light and motion like Gobi Night Sea, and using the yellow filter, yellow 12 filter, which is why there's no blue light left at all in the images. So the first image I got in the UK was this little cup coral at Eyemouth on a night dive. I had a hunch that cup corals and then burrowing anemones would fluoresce. So this burrowing anemone and the hermit crab were taken on a night dive in Loch Melfort, and the wee hermit crab with the cloak anemone wasn't expecting them to fluoresce, and these little crabs were all over the place. So that was a really nice dive and made me want to get more into it and experiment more with different species. So I think all of the red fluorescence that we've seen in the background here is due to algae and bacteria in the substrate. So if you shine the blue lights onto kelp or seaweeds, they'll tend to glow red, and that's the chlorophyll that fluoresces red. So a bit later on I got my Canon G7X, I think it was 2016, and was finally able to capture first images of fireworks and anemones in Loch Fyne fluorescing. I'm still using the yellow 12 filter at this point. And then later some light bulb tunicates, which also fluoresce really nicely, and these were in April 2017. So after these dives I was obviously more excited about underwater fluorescence and starting to realise that there were many more species that would fluoresce. And so I spent the next few years sort of experimenting as much as I could, different barrier filters, improving gear with brighter lights, trying out strobe filters, sort of learning how to take better fluo images. So I think rather than go through every single dive, I'll look through some of the species that I thought would fluoresce and some of the surprises that I've found sort of over the years, and look at a few individual images. So one of the species I'd suspected would fluoresce were these Devonshire cup corals. So it's an example of 3 different individual cup corals were taken in images with white light followed by blue lights of the same coral, just to show the difference between the white light and blue light, the fluorescence. So these were all taken with a yellow 12 barrier filter with the blue lights. And here's a cup coral. So this image was taken under white light, and most of you probably notice when you're imaging cup corals, you do see a bit of green fluorescence around the bases of the tentacles, and I think this is because the level of the proteins that do fluoresce is so high and they're so bright in these cup corals that you can see the reaction to the blue light that's in the white light or in the daylight that you're using to image them. So you can actually see the fluorescence showing just with white lights or daylight. This is the same cup coral taken with just blue light, so no filter at all. And you can see here there's more fluorescence starting to show, but a lot of it is still being washed out by the blue light. And then the same cup coral with the blue light and the yellow filter, so all the blue light is completely removed and all you're seeing is a lot more fluorescence. So I still think this would look a bit nicer with a little bit of the blue light left in, which is why I started to move away from the yellow 12 filter after a while, just to leave a bit more blue in the images. So I'd had a feeling that Cereanthus sort of burrowing anemones would fluoresce. So after seeing images of similar tube anemones from different locations around the world fluorescing, I sort of had a hunch that the ones we had in our waters would fluoresce as well. And they continued to be one of my favourite subjects to photograph. I think the one in the top right was just taken April, a night dive in Loch Long, and there was loads of these little tube anemones, and they just looked really nice under the blue lights and fluorescent. So I mentioned earlier about taking fluorescent shots during the day, even with some ambient light. So this image was taken, I think it was in Loch Leven, 6 or 7 meters depth, quite bright light during the day. But I was taking an aperture of 5.6, ISO of 200, and a shutter speed of 1/100th to try and remove as much of the ambient light as possible, so more of the fluorescence is showing up. And this was using the Inon diopter as well, so the UCR 165 wet lens. In this image, I was actually lucky to have this highly commended in the last year's BIUPC competition. So when I was just starting to get into underwater fluorescence, one species that was at my top of the list to try out was fireworks anemones. Already really impressive creatures, and anyone who dives with them will know there's a huge variation in the sort of colorations and patterns they show, and this is also true for the fluorescence patterns they display. It really does vary a lot between the individuals and doesn't necessarily match the sort of banding and spots patterns that you see under sort of normal light that they show. A few more examples of the different sort of fluorescence patterns seen in fireworks anemones. I think these were all in Loch Fyne. They might have all been in the same dive, and then this is a more unusual one. It was in Loch Crwyn, so the inner tentacles didn't fluoresce at all. And that one in the top right. As to the reasons why that is, I guess we don't really know. So a favourite one of mine that I got recently was this in Loch Duick in January this year. So this individual was almost completely white, and the inner tentacles were really dark red. But when I shone the blue lights on it, it's probably the brightest fluorescence I've seen in a fireworks anemone so far. So I was able to use an ISO of just 160, aperture of 2.5, and shutter speed was 1/100th for this one. And even still, the inner tentacles are a bit overexposed in the image. So I do try not to go slower than 1/100th or maybe 1/80th, just to try and keep the images a bit sharper. So while I was researching underwater fluorescence, I came across the work of David Gruber, who, along with a few other scientists, sort of published work in 2016 with work on fluorescence in cat shark species in America. So they had swell sharks in the Pacific and chain sharks in the Western Atlantic. I thought, well, if they're cat sharks, we'll fluoresce them, surely ours will as well. But I wasn't able to try this out until I think it was March 2018. I finally had a good chance to collect a few images of these sharks fluorescing in Scotland. And these images were actually from a dive in Loch Long in December 2019, January 2020. And these were taken with the fire dive gear lights and the yellow 12 filter. And these were all quite small sharks, so they were quite young individuals. And I've tend to notice that with the cat sharks, it's the smaller sharks that seem to fluoresce brighter than the larger adults. Again, not really sure why that is. These were all taken at around ISO 400, aperture of f2 and a 1/80th of a second shutter speed. And also seen that there does seem to be variation between how much the adults fluoresce as well. Haven't had a chance to check whether that's a difference between sexes or if it's just an age thing. I'm not totally sure about that. So I would obviously still like to get some nice of these sharks, and I've got some brighter lights, but I haven't had much luck in finding them on night dives this winter. Although when I was diving at the weekend just there in Loch Crieran, saw four cat sharks on that dive, so I think I might have to go for a late night summer night dive at some point very soon. So I've also found some fluorescence in thornbacks over the last couple of years. And this is a favourite recent one from Loch Leven in February this year. This is with the solar night sea lights with the leaf filter, so there's still some blue shown in the image, which I think looks quite nice. And again, this was ISO 400, so a 2.5 aperture and 1/100th of a second shutter speed. So I've found quite a few surprises in terms of species that I've seen fluorescing which didn't necessarily expect, and one of these was crustaceans such as hermit crabs, squat lobsters, and even barnacles. So this hermit crab in the top right had its shell covered with barnacles, and they were all fluorescing really brightly. This was in Loch Crieran last year, and that was really nice to see. Yeah, one of my favourites is these little hermit crabs with the cloak anemones. I think they look quite characterful anyway, but when they're fluorescing with the sort of edges of the anemone fluorescing behind the eyes, I think they can look quite nice. And this was again with the light and motion solar night sea lights. The leaf filter used a Nauticam CMC1 wet lens for this. Had an ISO of 320, so aperture of f4 and 1/80th of a second. Would have been nice to be able to use a bit of a smaller aperture, I think, to get a bit of better depth of field in this. So top knots were another unexpected surprise, and they're another species which there seems to be a huge variation in the fluorescence patterns between individuals. So these are all Ekstrom's top knot, and they're also taken with yellow 12. Sorry. Yeah, they're quite. Except the bottom left is a common top knot, not an Ekstrom's, and the bottom left one was taken with the yellow 12 filter. The other three were with the leaf filter. Hence why there's no blue light at all in the bottom left image. I think that would have looked quite nice to have a bit of blue left in it. It's also quite surprising just to see the completely green fluorescence in that individual, no other colours at all, where the others seem to show a bit of orange or red or even pink, like the small one in the top left, which was sort of taken in Loch Long back in, was that December last year? That was actually the first dive with the light and motion solar night sea lights, so it was quite nice to find that little guy on the reef. Was able to use an ISO of just 200 for this, aperture of 2.8, and again 1/100th of a second shutter speed. So I already had an idea that many sort of Cnidaria species would fluoresce, such as fireworks anemones, the burrowing anemones, snakelocks, even beadlet anemones as well. So I was keen to try this on other cnidarians, such as sea pens. So phosphorescent sea pens are already a favourite of mine to photograph normally. Pleased to discover that they also do fluoresce really nicely under the blue lights. But again, there's quite a bit of variation between individuals. So the ones shown here, they're the polyps and the inhalant polyps on the sort of spine that they have, were all fluorescing really brightly, but other individuals will show very weak fluorescence or even none at all on the polyps. These were all sort of macro images taken again with the Nauticam CMC1 wet lens. So something that was really unexpected when I was getting into the fluorescence diving was fluorescent nudibranchs. So I was doing a night dive on the wreck of the Breeder with Dive Oberon Argyle, sort of Shane Wazik's boat. And this was back in 2017. Swimming along with my mask barrier filter on, and the wreck's just covered in lots of little cup corals, so they were all fluorescing really nicely. And then occasionally you'd see this little really bright green splodge. I was like, no idea what that was until I got closer and found it was these Aelia papilosa nudibranchs, which was a real surprise. Now these aren't obviously the best images, so it didn't have the brightest lights at that time. They were taken with the yellow 12 filter, so there was no blue getting through the filter either. But obviously I was really happy to find fluorescent nymphs, and the one on the right there's Phaseolina bostoniensis in Loch Leven in 2020. So in April this year I was pleased to find some more Aeolidia papilosa in Loch Long. I had a bit of a better setup with me, so the fluorescence with these nudies is it's just amazing to see. This was quite a large individual, and these images were taken with the Nauticam CMC1 lens. So I had the 2 light emotion solar night sea lights with the Lee filter. I had to use ISO of 500 for these, so I could use a smaller aperture around 7.1, and again 1/100th of a second. So yeah, I had to use a bit of a higher ISO which would allow me to get a bit of a slightly better depth of field while using the wet lens on a full tele zoom with the compact. Again, later in April this year, I was able to did a couple of dives at the Cregan Bridge in Loch Ruin, which was just absolutely swarming with all sorts of these. There was loads of Fjordias, Carinella, Tritonias, as well as a couple of large Aelidia, these papillosas. So I'd taken my blue lights with me just on the off chance that I would find a few of these. And for normal photography, the dive conditions were lovely. So it was nice and shallow, only 6 meters depth, loads of ambient light, great visibility, which typically would be lovely. But again, not ideal for fluoro photography. I was able to get a couple of shots of these nudies, and was able to get this comparison shot with the strobe on the left to show how it would normally look, and then with the blue lights on the right hand side of the same individual. And this was shot using the Fantasy. This one was with no wet lens actually, and then another individual on the same dive. So this was using the Fantasy UCL 900F, so plus 15 diopter lens, the 2 light and motion night sea lights, and Lee filter again. And because there was so much ambient light, you can see there's a bit of a greeny yellow haze around the edges of the image that weren't getting the blue lights quite as much. So that can be a problem with ambient light while using the barrier filter. So one of the most common questions I get asked when sort of showing people fluorescence images are sort of what are the camera settings that you use? Are the colors real? How much post-processing do you do? So I've mentioned some of the camera settings that I've used throughout the talk, and trying to take images with least amount of noise as possible and as sharp as possible, which is not always easy with the compact. So I do try not to go slower than 1/80th of a second when taking images with the LED sort of constant lights, and I do try and use as ISO as possible, and definitely try and stay below sort of 500 or even 400 as a maximum, as that can start to introduce a lot of noise with my camera. So aperture wise, if I'm using the wet lens like the Nauticam or Fantasy, I'll have to try and use a small aperture as I can to get a better depth of field. In this case, I may need to use a sort of higher ISO shown in the other earlier images. It really does depend on the subject though. So fireworks and enemies, cup corals, and like light bulb tunicates will all fluoresce so brightly that it gives you a lot more freedom with the sort of exposure settings. Other things such as the cat sharks or rays may not be quite as bright, so it can be a little trickier to get the right settings to get a nice fluorescence image of them. So I thought I'd have a quick look at some of the post-processing that I do with the images I collect. And to be honest, most of the time I'm not really doing anything that special. It's just general workflow in Lightroom. I always leave my camera on auto white balance, whether it's fluorescence or normal photography, and then sort that in post. Some people might say that's quite lazy, but I find it works. It works quite well for me. And I actually really need to change or make huge changes to the white balance when editing with fluorescence images. The camera always seems to get pretty close to how it's actually seen. I've got a couple of different presets depending on the light or barrier filter combinations that I use, but I always try not to overdo it with the Lightroom sliders and go too unnatural. That's just a personal preference, of course. You could obviously change the images quite dramatically with the sort of white balance and color settings. You could quite easily remove all of the blue if you wanted, or enhance the greens, boost the vibrancy, etc. But I try not to do that too much. So as you can see from this nudie pic from Loch Long in April, I haven't really edited the colours all that much, just very slight adjustments to the white balance, exposure, bit of shadows and highlights, dehaze and vibrance. And then I'll usually, after editing in Lightroom, I'll put it into Photoshop to remove any sort of nasty bits of backscatter, such as these little pink blobs that were floating about. And same with this top knot image from Loch Long as well. That was the same light and filter combination as the previous image, so again the white balance settings are basically the same. And I always try and keep the images looking as natural as possible, so nothing's too overly done in the post-processing. This fireworks and enemy shot was different in that I took this using the Fire Dive Gear strobe filter and used the Fire Dive Gear barrier filter as well, which lets a bit more blue light flow through. So the white balance settings need to be slightly different, otherwise there'd be far too much blue if I used the same settings as for the other light and filter combination. But generally, again, it's just basic Lightroom workflow and not overdoing anything too much. So yeah, and again, I'll put this into Photoshop afterwards just to clean up a little bit. Yeah, I was lucky that this image placed as runner-up in the British Compact category of UPY this year, which I was really happy about. So on to something a little bit different, something I've been trying recently. Been experimenting with this for a little while. So in November 2020, my regular buddy of mine, Alistair Odell, showed me this little rock pool near Oban, which is full of snake locks and enemies. So we both took some macro images that night, and you can see in the image there, it was a really nice evening. So that got me wondering afterwards about try and split shot to get sort of nice sky as well as the fluorescent enemy in the rock pool. So I wasn't actually able to try this out until September last year, thanks to lockdowns, various things, etc. And one of the sort of obvious issues with trying to do this type of shot was if you're using blue lights, then you need to use a yellow barrier filter to remove the excess blue light in the underwater section, but then barrier filter would ruin the top half of the image where you want natural light. So thankfully, snake locks and enemies react really well to UV light and can be imaged like this with no barrier filter. So this is a couple of test shots I took in September last year. It was late one evening in September, using the UV light, no barrier filter, and a wee fine WF-L1 wet lens, which works really nicely with the Canon G7X and the Fantasy housing. So I learned quite quickly that trying to hold sort of the camera housing with the wide-angle lens on, which is quite heavy, and the UV torch by hand, and press the shutter all at the same time was near enough impossible and tricky to get sort of sharp images. So later last year, so in November, I started experimenting using a small underwater tripod setup, and this allowed me to capture these couple of images, which I was able to use f11, which is the smallest aperture I can with that camera, ISO of 125 and 1/10 of a second, which worked quite nicely, I think, but it's still a work in progress. Still not quite got the image I have in mind. On the lookout for new rock pools that I think would work quite nicely. Obviously, a lot of things have to come together to get this. So a nice sun, a low tide to get to the rock pool, no rain, yeah, the right time in the evening as well. So to try and get this right. So I'll be working on that a bit more this year. So I'd like to try and collect video of underwater fluorescence while I'm diving. So I've got a short clip to follow. Hopefully it plays okay. Shall see. So this was captured in Loch Long in March this year, and just shows a bit of sort of comparison between these species with white light and blue light. So it's the same individuals taken with white video lights, and then the blue lights with the barrier filter. So thanks very much for listening and inviting me along to speak to you all this evening. Hope some of that was interesting for you and I was able to give you some useful information for anyone thinking of getting into fluoro photography or trying it out again. I think the best thing is just to go out and try it. You never know what you're going to find. I always try and take the blue lights with me as much as possible, and obviously always regret it when I don't take them in because I tend to see something that I would like to try fluorescence with. Still being surprised by the species that fluoresce even now. So if you want to see any more of my images, I've got Instagram, Smug Mug website, and also find my channel on YouTube with lots more videos like the one just saw a second ago. And if you're interested in seeing more UK underwater fluorescence shots, I would highly recommend taking a look at work of these photographers here who are also capturing amazing images and video as well. And my buddy Alistair Riddell especially is taking lots of really nice fluoro nudie shots from around the Oban area. Yeah, thank you.